Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. A couple of weeks ago, I checked out the Asus ROG Strix XG27UCS and found it to be quite a well-optimized 1440p 180Hz IPS gaming monitor at its sub $300 US price. Well, today, I'm looking at its higher-end brother, the ROG Strix XG27UCS, which upgrades the panel to a 27-inch 4K 160Hz IPS LCD. We're also getting a pretty typical feature set, including adaptive sync, variable refresh rates, and eLMB backlight strobing. Unfortunately, the hardware isn't truly HDR capable despite advertising HDR with no local dimming functionality, so Asus will need to deliver excellent performance in other areas to pick up the slack. Initially, I was told this monitor would be priced at $450 US, but it looks like actual pricing has ended up at $500, putting it in competition with products like the LG 27GR93U. The design of this monitor is very similar to what we've seen from Asus in the past, minus the RGB LED lighting, as this is a more budget-friendly product. The front display area includes 3 slim bezels and a chin along the bottom edge, while on the rear you'll find typical gamer styling with vents, textures, and a large ROG logo. I tend to prefer a more minimalist design, but all this stuff is on the back, which is pretty easy to hide. The stand features a small squarish base with a cutout for slotting in your phone. The pillar has a cutout for cable management and supports a good range of ergonomic adjustment, including height, tilt, swivel, and pivot. The maximum level of height is a little short for my tastes, but the stand overall is sturdy and the adjustment mechanisms work well. As for build quality, almost all exterior surfaces are a dark grey plastic, and there's a red ring around the stand pillar's connection to the base. There's nothing overly premium about this build, which is in keeping with its budget price point, though on the positive side, it seems well put together. I would certainly prefer a lower price tag than a metal stand on a monitor in this range. The XG27UCS uses a BOE panel just like the XG27ACS, which comes with the standard matte anti-glare coating featuring moderate levels of grain. If you've used any LCD gaming monitor released over the last decade, you'll know what to expect here. It's an effective coating that minimizes reflections. The port selection is quite basic, with one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, one HDMI 2.1 port at 48 gigabits per second, and one USB-C supporting DP alt mode. There's no USB hub, so we don't get KVM switch functionality, and the USB-C port is limited to just 15 watts of power delivery, which is insufficient for charging most laptops. However, it's good to see no refresh rate limitations on the ports. The OSD is controlled through a directional toggle and includes a pretty good range of features for a bang-for-buck monitor. Many of the things you get on high-end Asus displays are included here, like all the gaming options, crosshairs, FPS counters, timers, shadow boosting, and so on. But in addition to this, we get various color space modes, adjustable eLMB, and even an overdrive slider that has 21 options. Overall response time performance is very similar to the XG27ACS, which is a good thing. Variable overdrive is included, which adjusts the level of overdrive depending on the refresh rate, allowing for a more optimal experience when using adaptive sync. It's something that historically has only been included with higher-end products, and if implemented properly, leads to a single overdrive mode experience. When looking at OD level 0, we see native panel performance, which is in the 10 millisecond range. Increasing the slider to OD level 5 delivers an 8 millisecond average response, which is still not good enough to deliver decent refresh compliance. For that, we'll need to assess the default setting, which is OD level 10. Here is where performance looks pretty decent, and this monitor is very well optimized out of the box. We get a 5.4 millisecond average response time, cumulative deviation around 450, and practically no inverse ghosting. The response time numbers we're seeing here also mean decent refresh compliance, properly supporting the 160Hz refresh rate. At high settings, we run into the usual issues of extreme levels of overshoot, even at OD level 15. While final response time numbers can be pushed down to around 3 milliseconds, the amount of overshoot is significant, and this causes a lot of artifacts, so the higher part of the overdrive range isn't that useful. Even adjusting the settings slightly up to an OD level of 11 or 12 doesn't provide much advantage relative to the default position of 10. With that said, it's nice to have adjustable overdrive control so you can tune it to your liking, which might be handy in colder or warmer climates. It's great to confirm that variable overdrive does actually work. As we move down the variable refresh rate range, variable overdrive pulls back on the level of overdrive slightly to keep performance optimized and overshoot in check. This leads to a 6.6 millisecond average response at 100 Hz with no inverse ghosting, and a 7.7 millisecond experience at 60 Hz, again with no inverse ghosting. Typically, when we see monitors delivering 5 milliseconds at 160 Hz, there would be quite a bit of overshoot at 60 Hz using the same overdrive settings, but with variable overdrive that isn't the case, leading to a single overdrive mode experience. You can keep this display on OD level 10 and enjoy gaming at all refresh rates with few artifacts. At its maximum refresh rate, the Asus XG27UCS offers similar performance to competing products like the LG 27GR93U and Gigabyte M27U. There's a little less overshoot from the Asus model, but in terms of response times, there's about 1 millisecond of difference either way, which is negligible. It does significantly outperform the MSI 274 UPF, and to get something noticeably faster, you'll have to grab a Samsung Odyssey Neo G7 with a VA panel. Average performance is also pretty competitive with other products without being a standout. We're again looking at pretty similar results between the XG27UCS and the 27GR93U. The Gigabyte M27U features high overshoot at slightly faster response times, while the Asus model is better tuned than older products like the LG 27GP950. The only real difference between the UCS and 27GR93U is that the Asus model allows you to get the best performance at 160 Hz seen in the previous chart and the best average performance seen in this chart with the same overdrive setting. The LG model requires you to turn down the overdrive slightly for adaptive sync gaming across the refresh range. In general though, there really isn't a lot separating most of these modern 4K LCD panels, as you can see in the cumulative deviation figures. The XG27UCS is basically identical to the M27U, while the 27GR93U is just 5% better. While the 1440p ACS model ends up with a result of 480, even that is just 12% better than the UCS, which is difficult to notice in practice. The experience this monitor provides is quite balanced, and there's no obvious flaws to motion performance, but it's also not a standout in any way. For gaming at fixed refresh rates like 120 and 60 Hz, the XG27UCS also performs well while remaining in the middle part of the charts. The 60 Hz numbers in particular might be important for console gamers, and again, you get this level of performance without needing to tweak overdrive. The XG27UCS supports eLMB sync, which is Asus's backlight strobing technology that works with adaptive sync simultaneously. This feature can deliver a clarity improvement at higher refresh rates near 160 Hz, but doesn't work especially well when the refresh rate drops, and around 120 Hz, it's basically as blurry as not using eLMB. Even at 160 Hz, there are some crosstalk artifacts and noticeable red fringing due to the KSF backlight. On top of this, the feature is extremely dim, outputting just 25 nits with no ability to change brightness. There's also the option to use eLMB without adaptive sync, which does work better at lower fixed refresh rates and gives you options to adjust strobe timing and length. It's also much brighter, with the longest strobe length producing 240 nits and the shortest at 100 nits actually usable, unlike eLMB sync. However, it doesn't work at 60 Hz and still has some quality issues. It's not an awful implementation by any means, it's just not something I would use on this monitor when the response time experience without eLMB is pretty reasonable. Input lag is very good with just 0.6 milliseconds of processing delay at its maximum refresh rate. However, most other monitors with a similar refresh rate also deliver a similar amount of latency. The main limiting factor here is the refresh rate. I was also pleased to see less than 1 millisecond of latency when using this display in its fixed 60 Hz mode, which is pretty rare. The XG27UCS is a very efficient monitor as far as power consumption is concerned. At just 22 watts, it has notably lower power usage than the M27U and 27GR93U, about a 20% reduction at the same brightness output. In fact, power is almost halved compared to some of the other models in this chart, like the 27GP950 and zoned backlight options such as the GP27U. If you really want to make sure your setup is efficient and cost-effective to run in a country with high power prices, I guess this could be a small factor in the Asus model's favour. As for color performance, this monitor offers a standard wide gamut experience, 95% coverage of the DCI-P3 color space, similar for Adobe RGB, and then 72% coverage of Rec 2020. This isn't quite as good as the ACS model, but again, very similar to the LG and Gigabyte monitors that have been the focus of many comparisons so far. Factory calibration in the default mode is pretty impressive for a gaming monitor, especially for grayscale. There's no obvious color tint to this display out of the box, gamma is very good, and delta E results are low, indicating great accuracy. However, as is typical for gaming monitors, the default mode leaves the color gamut unclamped, so standard SDR content is expanded to fill this gamut, leading to oversaturation, and this hurts delta E performance. Compared to other monitors, the XG27UCS is quite well calibrated for grayscale, coming in near the top of the chart. This is a marginally better result than the 27GR93U and much better than the M27U. In color checker though, not a huge difference to the other models, which all come with unclamped gamuts by default. Where the Asus model separates itself from the pack is its fully unlocked sRGB mode, available through the display color space setting in the OSD. This gives you sRGB color space emulation while still giving access to white balance and other settings. On top of this, there's also a dedicated sRGB mode, which is more restrictive but even better calibrated from the factory. Delta E performance in this mode is excellent, with ITP averages below 5.0. This puts the UCS in a good spot competitively. For grayscale, the sRGB mode is much better than the 27GR93U and slightly better than the M27U, while for color checker, again, it outperforms both of those displays. So across default and sRGB mode performance, the Asus model delivers decent color results relative to its nearest competitors. There's also the option for a full software calibration, which I performed through CalMan, which led to an improvement in accuracy, but probably isn't necessary for this monitor. Really what Asus are providing out of the box here with the sRGB mode and unlocked color space modes should be sufficient for most users, allowing for a great range of in-hardware calibration. Maximum brightness is good at 445 nits, 18% higher than the M27U if you desperately need the additional brightness. With that said, most LCDs are sufficient for typical indoor usage. It's also not as bright as the latest mini LED products like the XV275K-P3, which is designed for HDR. Minimum brightness is on the border of acceptable at 53 nits. The most disappointing aspect to the XG27UCS is its contrast ratio of just 910:1, which is bad. This is also true of the panels used in the M27U and 27GR93U, but it's still disappointing to see when better IPS LCDs have contrast in the 1100:1 range. Still quite poor, but about 20% better than this Asus model. This monitor simply does not have good black levels, and it's quite obvious when using it for darker scenes in a dark room. If you care at all about contrast ratio, then VA LCDs are significantly superior to today's IPS tech. Viewing angles are decent without being anything special. This sort of IPS panel is bang on average in this area compared to other IPS panels I've seen. Uniformity is okay, but not the best, especially around the edges. Fine for gaming though. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. Asus do an average job of advertising this monitor. I appreciate them not emphasizing HDR, but they do still claim it supports HDR, which it does technically, just not in any meaningful way, as the hardware doesn't include any dimming functionality and it has a low contrast ratio. It's a fake HDR product. Response time numbers are also a bit misleading, though this is typical of most LCDs. Surprisingly, Asus didn't advertise factory calibration when they probably should be, merely calling it factory checked, whatever that means. As for feature support matrix, because Asus advertised HDR support, there are quite a few misses here, such as for HDR level brightness and contrast, as well as HDR color performance. EOHF tracking in the HDR mode is reasonable, but it has poor black levels and poor peak brightness, so it's pretty hard to call that a good experience. I'm also not sure whether this monitor supports firmware updates, though at this point hasn't really needed one. Where this monitor succeeds though is in the motion areas, with ticks for refresh compliance, single overdrive mode experience, decent cumulative deviation, and a low input lag. As an IPS LCD, it also features no flickering or pixel inversion, RGB stripe level text clarity, and no risk of burn-in. However, it lacks more advanced inputs like a USB hub or KVM switch. Overall, the Asus ROG Strix XG27UCS is a good, well-performing 27-inch 4K LCD gaming monitor. If you're after that sort of hardware, this is a perfectly fine choice. However, it doesn't really stand out from the pack to any significant degree, whether we look at performance or pricing. There's nothing wrong with this display really, but it's not a must-buy or overly exciting product. Motion performance, for example, is pretty good. It packs variable overdrive functionality and a great single overdrive mode experience. It's reasonably fast, there's no issues with overshoot or dark smear, and input latency is low. But when you compare the XG27UCS to most other modern 27-inch 4K gaming monitors, performance is roughly the same. The level of tuning here provides decent results, but it's not a specific reason to purchase this monitor. Color performance is where Asus do have a small advantage through excellent factory calibration and an unlocked sRGB mode. This monitor is pretty much ready to go out of the box and needs few if any tweaks. But it's let down a bit due to a poor contrast ratio, and again, most other areas aren't really a standout. While the 1440p XG27ACS was able to offer compelling tuning and performance relative to its competitors, the competition is tougher and better in the 4K market at this price tier, so there's less wiggle room to offer the best tuned experience. Though, don't get me wrong, the UCS model is still very well tuned. The XG27UCS current price tag of $500 US is too expensive, given how similar it is to the Gigabyte M27U, currently just $400 US and regularly listed at or below $450, and also because of how similar it is to the LG 27GR93U, which since the middle of the year has regularly dropped to $430 US or lower. The initial price I was told for this Asus monitor makes a lot more sense. $450 is far more competitive with the Gigabyte and LG models, and while it's probably not cheap enough to be the obvious choice, it would be hard to ignore this model's generally great performance. The other main drawback to the XG27UCS is the complete lack of any real HDR functionality, as there's no local dimming at all. I'm yet to test a super compelling mini LED LCD at a similar price, but the Acer Nitro XV275K P3 is just $550 US, $50 more than this Asus model, and it offers a 576 zone backlight with true HDR functionality. I gave it a mixed review due to several firmware annoyances, but still, around the $500 mark and above, I think 4K LCDs need to be offering some form of actual HDR. This is especially true when gamers don't necessarily need to pick a 4K panel to get a great gaming experience. The 1440p OLED LG 27GR95QE is just $600 US these days and is arguably a much better gaming monitor for the average PC gamer at just a 20% premium. To choose an SDR-only 4K monitor like this, you'd have to be heavily preferencing the balance that this format can bring between gaming and other stuff like productivity and web browsing. And right now, at this price, again, I just don't think this is an especially compelling monitor. And anyway, that does it for this review. As always, this could be a monitor that's worth considering if the pricing is right in your region. So as always, it's probably a good idea to go and check out how this monitor compares to the Gigabyte, LG, and other models in your region in terms of pricing. We do have links in the description below for that. Also, if you want to support Monitors Unboxed and the testing that we do here at the channel, please consider supporting us on Patreon or Floatplane. Links to those are in the description below. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.